Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Gonzii and yes, I'm back. I've been enjoying life.
One of the biggest debates in the Fnaf community for a while now has been whether or not the franchise's various books are in the same timeline as the games. So when a game based on one of the books in the Fazbear Fright series was announced, a lot of people figured it would finally put the debate to rest. The thing is, while the Into the Pit game did seem to convince some people of an answer, as shown by these polls, it definitely didn't put an end to the debate, which is a bit of a problem when it comes to trying to figure out how much of the game can and should be used for theorizing. Fortunately, I think there's not only pretty solid evidence to explain how Into the Pit and the series it's based on fit into the games, but I think the game also explains a major part of the Fnaf lore that's been glossed over for years. That being said, a lot of you may be wondering why this is even a debate to begin with. After all, Into the Pit is a game, so wouldn't that mean that it and the stories connected to it would have to be in the timeline of the games? Well, like most things in Fnaf, it's a bit more complicated than that. For one thing, the Into the Pit game may be based on a story in the books, but it doesn't exactly match it. The general premise remains the same, of a boy named Oswald finding a ball pit in a restaurant called Jeff's Pizza that seems to take him back in time to Freddy's in 1985, only for him to see the aftermath of William Afton's murders and for his dad to get replaced by a monstrous yellow rabbit until Oswald is able to rescue him. But the game takes that premise in a very different direction from its source material. In the book, Oswald spends a solid amount of his summer visiting the past every day to hang out at Freddy's until he sees the dead kids and his dad gets replaced. After that, he only goes back to Jeff's the very next night, where after playing along with the yellow rabbit being his dad throughout the day, he books it for Jeff's, finds his dad unconscious at the bottom of the pit, no visiting Freddy's required, and only then gets attacked by the yellow rabbit and fights him off. Meanwhile, the game ends up changing a lot of this. Instead of spending multiple days hanging out with the friends he made at Freddy's, he ends up meeting them and witnessing the aftermath of the yellow rabbit killing 6 kids all in the same day. Rather than the yellow rabbit mostly just leaving Oswald alone and pretending to be his dad until Oswald's actively pulling his real dad out of the ball pit, Oswald has to actually hide from the thing to sneak around the house multiple times to go back to Freddy's, rescue a bunch of other kids, and eventually find his dad in Freddy's instead of at the bottom of the pit. There are a bunch of changes to when things happen, what characters say and do, and even the location of the ball pit has changed, with it being in the pizzeria's main room in the book with Oswald fully aware of it, compared to the game where it's in a side room he'd never seen before. Obviously, a lot of these changes are for the sake of making the gameplay work and being an interesting game, and as someone who enjoys the story of the game quite a bit, I am glad they did so. But these are still pretty fundamental changes that just aren't compatible with the story that it's based on. To argue that this game existing means the exact events of the book are in the game continuity really doesn't work, since the game itself doesn't match the book. Plus, with the creator of the franchise, Scott Cawthon, saying he hopes more games based on the books could be made during his most recent interview with Dawko, that would lead to the stories changing even more as they made the shift from the books to the games. However, in part because of Scott hoping to produce future games based on the books, and because of how Into the Pit connects to other stories in the Fazbear Fright series, as shown through some of the secret minigames and Easter eggs we can find in the game, the argument could be made that a similar set of events do take place in the game timeline, just altered or rebooted to fit the game continuity of events. That being said, another complicating factor is that during that same interview with Dawko, Into the Pit and any future games based on the books are referred to as spin-offs by Dawko, something that Scott doesn't refute. Instead, he moves right past that to talk about how he's thinking the next one should be the Fazbear Fright story Fetch. So while yes, Into the Pit is a game, it doesn't seem like Scott considers it a mainline game, which becomes important when we consider that we have had spin-off games in the past that definitely aren't in-universe events, such as Fury's Rage and Freddy in Space 2. Into the Pit is a spin-off game based on a spin-off book series, and while that doesn't necessarily confirm it's a separate timeline from the main games, it definitely puts it in more of a gray area than it otherwise would be. Not to mention, the Into the Pit game apparently wasn't even going to be accessible to fans initially. While talking about the game's development, Scott mentions that it was first going to be a little novelty game on a physical cartridge, and it only ended up on Steam for everyone to play since the development was going so well that, instead of being a small game for a cartridge, it ended up becoming a full-fledged game that Scott and Megacat Studios wanted to share with everyone. Speaking of sharing the game with everyone, Megacat Studios actually reached out to me a few weeks ago and offered me codes for 2 extra copies of Into the Pit. And as of the launch of this video, I'll be holding an art contest giveaway for the Steam keys on my Discord server. So if you haven't had the chance to play Into the Pit yet and want to give it a shot, the Discord is linked at the top of the video description, and you can find the rules in place for submissions there. Entries will be accepted for 1 month after this video goes live, so make sure to check it out while you have the time. But with all that said, since Into the Pit is a game, game, but one with a sort of ambiguous connection to the main series of games. Is there a way for us to tell if Into the Pit is meant to be in the same continuity as the main games, now that we do have it? Well, I think the answer to that question is yes, and there are a few other questions we can answer in order to explain why. Specifically, we need to consider the way the role of the books in the series has changed over time, what the purpose of the Into the Pit game is supposed to be in relation to that, and of course, what evidence there actually is in terms of its connections to the other games. The first of these questions is one of the most important ones to address, since I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about how the books factor into the wider Fnaf franchise, particularly in terms of what constitutes canon. Technically speaking, everything in Five Nights at Freddy's is canon, and has been ever since the first book series started coming out, back when Fnaf 4 was meant to be the final game in the series. In a post addressing concerns about how the Silver Eyes novel didn't match up with the games, Scott mentioned that the books are canon in the same way the games are, but they shouldn't be considered to be in the same continuity or timeline of events. The Silver Eyes was a reimagining of the story and not meant to actually match up with the games or fill in any gaps. In fact, Scott went so far as to say that they shouldn't be used at all to solve the games despite being in the same canon. That being said, he did end up walking that back to some degree later down the line when he did end up using a lot of the elements first established in the books when he eventually ended up continuing what was meant to be a finished story. So it does seem like the novel trilogy can now be used for some degree of evidence. I will say this hasn't been as much of an issue recently, but I often see people suggest that some of the books shouldn't be used at all for theorizing because of this post, and I feel like it's important to point out the circumstances that it was made in and how things changed afterwards. This applies even more so to the Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex series. I'm not going to be touching on Tales much in this video since that's its own whole can of worms, but since Into the Pit is based on a Fazbear Frights story, I think it's really important to factor in what Scott's intentions were with the series. In pretty stark contrast to his statements on the novel trilogy, Scott mentioned in various posts that Frights would answer some questions and fill in gaps for the games, as well as that some stories would be directly connected to the games. We can pretty clearly see this in a lot of ways, such as the story The Man in Room 1280, more or less explaining that the game Ultimate Custom Night was a nightmare coma William Afton was put through by the vengeful spirit of one of his victims. Additional examples include the Stitch Wraith epilogues giving more explanation on possession and how it works, and Into the Pit doubling down on the date that the novel trilogy gave for William Afton's murders being 1985. These books are meant to help solve the games, and they have been used to do that. The issue comes when trying to figure out just how far its similarities actually go. There's a lot of debate when it comes to what exactly Scott meant with the way he worded his posts about the Fazbear Frights books. Some have interpreted him saying some of the stories are directly connected to the games to mean that some of the stories, specifically the ones connected to the Stitch Wraith epilogues, since that's the focus of the series' overarching plot, are directly in the game continuity. Meanwhile, others have taken it to instead refer to stories that may have pretty direct connections to games, such as Room for One More taking place in the sister location bunker and The Man in Room 1280 explaining Ultimate Custom Night, but may also be incompatible with the games, such as what we found taking place in the Fnaf 3 location focusing on the security guard, but instead of the protagonist lasting a week before the location burns down, the whole burning situation starts after one night of Springtrap being in the building. A lot of debate around this is just a matter of how different people interpret the wording of Scott's post. And since presumably none of us are mind readers, our interpretations of what he meant isn't the best evidence for how much the Fazbear Frights books, or at least whatever the game versions of them may be, would overlap with the main continuity of the games. And this leads into the second question I mentioned about what the purpose of Into the Pit in terms of the franchise could be. Even if it is a spin-off, it's still a pretty story-heavy game based on a book series that was meant to answer some questions about the games. While the story did change as it made the transition from book to game format, an argument could be made that it wouldn't make much sense for Scott to choose this story as the topic for a game and allow it to release if he wasn't trying to make a statement about how the books fit into the game continuity, or at least create a version of events that did. After all, what would be the point in making it not take place in the game timeline? Well, while it doesn't answer the main question one way or another, we do actually have an answer to this one. All the way back in the first post Scott made about the canonicity of the books, one thing he said there that I don't think gets taken into account very often is how, sometimes, the lore of something can become so crowded that you can't tell an original story anymore. If he was saying this all the way back before Sister Location came out, I would imagine it applies even more now that so many more games are out. Plus, we do have modern instances of him diverging from the main timeline in order to tell an interesting story. For example, the Five Nights at Freddy's movie is based on the story of the games, and was described by Scott to be a retelling of the first game back in the original interview he did with Daco. But the movie did end up making some pretty major changes to the story and characters for the sake of being able to actually tell a story, instead of just being a guy silently flipping through cameras for 5 nights that that we only get the backstory for multiple games down the line. While the movie and the Into the Pit game aren't necessarily equivalent, it does show that Scott still doesn't intend every piece of FNAF media that's come out since the original novel trilogy to be in the main continuity. Though on the topic of the movie, there's something connected to it that I think is particularly relevant to this discussion. After all, in addition to the movie itself, there's a novel that came out based on it, and there are a whole bunch of ways that it differs from the movie. Things such as how the characters look, what they say, what they do. Even the identities of the characters in each animatronic get mixed around when comparing the book to the movie itself. While Scott did eventually say that this was an older draft of the book that accidentally got published, the only thing he mentioned actually changing and not being canon to the franchise was the characterization of Doug. So with how much in the book is different from the movie, I'd be surprised if the other differences were all completely wiped out in the later draft. I bring this up because I think it makes a really important point. The FNAF movie is a spin-off based on the games, but just as the movie isn't in the same timeline as the games, the book isn't even in the same timeline as the movie it's a novelization of, even if it still has a lot in common with it. On top of this, just because there is a book, that doesn't mean that it's in the same continuity as, say, the novel trilogy. The medium of storytelling may be the
My opinion on this, is that, and ID's making it's another phenomenal video by her. She's amazing, But listen, like, we saw game theory that this game is meant for us to see who Freddy Bro was, which was Oswald's dad, just like we had Cassie's dad being Bonnie Bro, right? I see a reason for that to be in the game, the mask, the Freddy mask, when we go to the attic. If the whole game's purpose is to show that, it was a huge success, bro, in my opinion.
Same, and there is some overlap in terms of plot points and characters, but that doesn't mean that Scott was intending for them to fit together in one continuity, and I feel like this shouldn't be ignored when considering Into the Pit. If Fazbear Frights are in the game timeline, I'd say the best answer to what Into the Pit and the future spin-offs' purposes would be is to show the version of those stories that take place in the main continuity of the games. However, an argument could pretty easily be made that if the Fright stories are meant to be a spin-off, even if it does have some overlap, it could be in a similar situation to the movie and its novelization, not being the same as each other, but also not being in the book timeline. Which finally leads us to question 3. Is Into the Pit compatible with the continuity established by the main series of games? Since similarities aren't enough to prove something is in the same continuity, is there anything to indicate that Into the Pit couldn't take place in the main continuity? I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. And it's not because of the Easter eggs for things that shouldn't be possible, like Garrett's plane from the movie or the poster of Toy Bonnie at a location before the character existed, nor is it the fact that there are 6 victims instead of the 5 mentioned in FNAF 1, or even the fact that the bodies were out in the open in a party room with everyone running away screaming instead of actually being hidden in the suits and just reported missing after being lured to the safe room. While I do think these points are interesting, some have argued that the version of Freddy's inside the ball pit isn't completely accurate, and given the existence of the yellow rabbit monster instead of William Afton, that argument does have some ground. So to accommodate that perspective, I'm going to point to something firmly outside of the ball pit as evidence, and that evidence is the location of Oswald's school. We first learned that the Five Nights at Freddy's series generally takes place in and around Hurricane, Utah, thanks to the novel trilogy, and this approximate location was confirmed for the games thanks to the lawsuits in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator showing the game to take place in Washington County, Utah, the same county where Hurricane is located. That being said, not all continuities take place in Hurricane. For example, the FNAF movie takes place in an entirely different state, with the court documents that appear in the movie showing that the film takes place in Minnesota. Into the Pit's differences aren't quite so drastic. After all, we can tell it's still in Utah thanks to the flag outside of Oswald's school looking a whole lot like the Utah state flag before it recently got changed on March 9th, 2024. However, that flag isn't the only location indicator we have to go off of. We also know the name of Oswald's school, Westbrook Middle School. As it turns out, there is a location called Westbrook in the state of Utah. 3 of them actually, each of them being neighborhoods in different cities that are relatively near each other in the northern part of the state. While none of them have a Westbrook Middle School, one does, or rather did, have a Westbrook Elementary, making it the most likely of the 3 to be the actual location of the story, as that's where the book version of Into the Pit's events start us off, with Oswald's last day of school there. This Westbrook is located in the city of Taylorsville, and not only is it definitely not Hurricane, it and the other Westbrooks are located on the entire opposite side of the state. While one could try to make the argument that only Pizzeria Simulator has to actually take place in Washington County, as that's the only game where a location is directly mentioned, that doesn't really work when we factor in the Stitch Wraith epilogues, something I think we should do given the fact that the Stitch Wraith can appear during during Into the Pit, and how much of the overarching plot of the epilogues connect back to the ball pit and the events of Pizzeria Simulator. The ball pit is a major point of connection between the stories in Fazbear Frights, with it being visited and used by both the Stitch Wraith and another character called Detective Larson during the epilogues, and they do so in ways that show clear connections between it and other stories in the series. Additionally, there's a fire site mentioned that the Stitch Wraith goes to multiple times, and the epilogues make it pretty clear that the fire site was the Pizzeria Simulator fire.
Okay.
The epilogues mention how it was connected to one of the founders of Fazbear Entertainment, alluding to Henry Emily being the one to set the trap and burn it down, and that the puppet was part of the evidence that was kept in storage when the case went unsolved. I don't know about you, but I find it incredibly unlikely that the Stitch Wraith made the trek from Westbrook all the way to Hurricane and back, or that Detective Larson's department would be in range of both the ball pit and the fire site, unless, in the Fazbear Frights continuity, neither Freddy's nor Pizzeria Simulator were in Washington County. Unless there's a Westbrook in Utah that just wasn't showing up in the Google search results, the most logical solution is that the events around Freddy's and Pizzeria Simulator in the Fazbear Frights continuity don't take place in Washington County, and as such are not compatible with the main continuity of the games. I want to be clear that I don't think Into the Pit or Fazbear Frights in general should be ignored. In fact, I think Into the Pit gives us some good insight into something I haven't really seen talked about much in the games, and that's how on earth playing an arcade game could give us flashbacks to the past like we see with, say, Fruity Maze or Midnight Motorist during Pizzeria Simulator. After all, logically speaking, it wouldn't make much sense for these events to end up as playable minigames in these arcade machines unless something supernatural was going on. While Into the Pit is a different scenario, I actually think it explains how something like this is possible to some degree. As much as jokes about the time travel ball pit get thrown around, technically speaking, the ball pit probably isn't actually time travel. If it was, it would have been William Afton himself crawling out of the thing and somehow pretending to be Oswald's dad, not the monstrous version of him as the yellow rabbit we actually see in the game. Instead, the ball pit seems to contain memories, and in the case of Into the Pit, the distorted memory of the pizzeria at the time the Freddy's murders happened. Additionally, we know from the Frights epilogues that this isn't the only memory in there, though it does seem to be the strongest, with memories and souls from various people who died outside of Freddy's ending up in the ball pit. I think that the arcade machines are in a similar situation of memories that were strong enough, and at one point close enough, even if the events were not experienced in direct proximity to those machines, to haunt the arcade cabinets.
I'm agreeing with everything she's saying.
We may not be interacting with them to the same degree Oswald does with the pit's recreation of William Afton's murders, but we are interacting with and reliving them nonetheless. So is Into the Pit in the main game continuity? Probably not. I think it's most likely just a reimagining of a cool story that, while initially never intended to end up in the hands of the fanbase, grew into an amazing game that happened to work out really well as an anniversary event due to highlighting the event that kickstarted major events of the story across all continuities, while also making the story more accessible to fans who haven't read the book. But even if it isn't game continuity, it is still canon, and it would be a disservice to ignore it and the explanations it could give for other things in the lore. But hey, this is of course just a theory. A game theory, one might say.
Let's
and
go!
You're welcome to have your own.
Alright, so there you have it, man. Shout out to ID. She is a phenomenal content creator. Go subscribe to her. Link in the description below. And yeah, man, she made a lot of valid points. I agree with pretty much all the video. Thank you so much for watching the video, man. All glory to God as always. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.